This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Jeff, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me. It's a real honor to join you.
Oh, I appreciate that. Glad you could be here. So you have a book on inflation in the family, and I want to just go through, and I know you've been doing the book tour and such, but it's of particular relevance to this audience. And specifically, I noticed early on, you mentioned how like the inspiration for you going down this path was a footnote in a Guido Hülsmann book. Is that right?
That's right. And it really corresponds with my introduction to the Austrian School of Economics. The book we're referring to here is Guido's 2008 Ethics of Money Production. And I'm a relative newcomer to Austrian economics. I didn't even discover the school of thought until 2010. Interestingly, at a conference at Hillsdale College, which I know, Bob, you had been there for a bit. And that was the first place I had heard the name of Mises or Hayek. And so began to dive in and quickly found the Mises.org website and all the great resources there. And that title, The Ethics of Money Production, really caught my eye. So funny story on that. This was in the days I wasn't making much money, and I was working at a school, and I downloaded the PDF, and I got tired of reading it on the screen, so printed it off in total, and I got a nice finger wagging from one of my colleagues about using too much printer paper. But as I was reading through the book, chapter 13 had this line, very important one, that said that fiat currency inflation is a juggernaut of social, economic, cultural, and spiritual destruction. And that's a very thought-provoking line, but as I was sort of living some of the cultural and social impacts, especially as a young married guy trying to make ends meet, that really hit home in a very practical way. And so little did I know that about 10 years later, I would be studying with Guido in the PhD program in Angers, France. And so that's a little bit of that story, but that line has always stuck with me. And as you noted, was really the inspiration for my dissertation, which has now been turned into this book. So that's the story of where this came from.
Okay, well, great. So I imagine people have a general sense of where we're going with this and some of the particulars. But before we dive into that, let me just ask you, because I was fascinated to see as I was looking through the book, that you have a whole section like the history of economic thought on this topic before the rise of like the Gary Becker approach to, social analysis using economic tools. So can you maybe summarize some of the highlights of what was the state of the literature on this topic before the, Chicago school lens?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And that history of thought does go back quite a ways. For most folks who remember their Econ 101 class, you might recall that the word economics in English is derived from the Greek oikonomia, and that is actually a reference to a book by a Greek writer by the name of Xenophon, and it indeed was all about household management. And most folks are probably familiar with the term oikos when they go through their dairy section and see oikos yogurt, right? This was, but this is a reference to sort of like homemade goodness of this yogurt, right? But that's the idea of an oikos. It's a Greek household. And one thing that people should understand is that the Greek households, the oikos, it had a really significant division of labor. People who would have been regarded as, I'll use air quotes here, regarded as slaves, had a lot of different occupations within these oikos households, everything from financial managers to farm managers to even medical and teaching services within a household. And so again, you've got an extensive division of labor. And when we think about the study of economics, that's one of the foundational principles, is that we grow wealth and improve our standard of living by engaging in an extensive division of labor. And for the Greeks, this is happening in the oikos, the household, and as time develops, we see that really move throughout the rest of society. So this is really at the core, I thought. It's just interesting that there's been not as much work on family economics in the entire history of economics being done, but it is interesting that the root of it was household management, if you will.
Well, and what's interesting too is, I don't think it was ever called this, like when I was going through school, and for some people watching, like I'm not that old. But I'm pretty sure like when my parents went to school, it was called home ec, like short for home economics.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's been a point of confusion when I sometimes introduce my area of study here. I say family economics, and to get somebody twist their head, like home economics? Well, not exactly. What we're really looking at, and this is a reference to Becker and his work, he was calling on economists to look at the broader macroeconomy and see how those realities impact household life. And so, in a sense, I have that inspiration from Professor Hülsmann, but then also from Becker, who said, let's take a look at macroeconomic variables and how it impacts the household. And so from the Greeks, from Xenophon forward, there is quite a string of a history of economic thought around the family. And that string is not it's not as deliberate as it is incidental. And I can describe some of those thinkers, but there are breadcrumbs throughout the history of economic thought that point to economics and how the broader picture impacts household decisions. But I'd love to touch on some of those if
Yeah,
you'd
sure.
like
Go
to
ahead.
dive in.
Yeah.
So if you move on from Xenophon, we take quite a jump forward, and I like to, as an Austrian, go to the scholastic school, and one figure in particular, Juan de Mariana. Now, a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with de Mariana and his strong condemnation of money debasement, and saying that if a king or a prince does this, then that's grounds for tyrannicide, right? So a very controversial statement that got him into quite a bit of trouble in his day. But one of the things that in de Mariana's writing that comes out very clearly is that it's the king's household, right? It's him and his servants and his family members who are the immediate beneficiaries of new money creation through this debasement process. And so de Mariana is concerned about moral questions here of excessive greed and so on and so forth, and said, look, this is grounds for removing a king, detaching them from life itself for this kind of practice on moral grounds, really. But de Mariana is describing an effect that not too much later would be picked up by Richard Cantillon. And Richard Cantillon, 1700s, there's an essay on economics that we've got a great translation of at the Mises Institute that was overseen by Dr. Thornton. And that's one of those great books that's available online for free. But it's Cantillon who really describes in household terms, and this is a really captivating bit of reading for me. He describes in household terms how when new money creation happens, you have these early beneficiaries, those first recipients of the new money creation, and he describes how their households will specifically be better off, better and higher quality food, better clothing, more ornate houses, and so on and so forth. So he describes those early recipients much like de Mariana had. But what Cantillon does is he then extends it to the later recipients and says, look, once that initial set of recipients has bid up prices, then the folks who don't see their incomes increase, or later recipients of new money creation, they're left to deal with higher prices, and they are harmed by this inflationary money growth. And so that really moves us forward into the 1700s and the thought there that Cantillon brings forward. But again, Cantillon, his main focus is not the family per se. Mm-hmm. It's just, this is what the process of inflation looks like and how it manifests in society.
Okay. Well, is it appropriate at this point to jump into like what Becker's approach was more specifically?
I think we can go there. And of course, Becker, part of the Chicago School, but we also, when people think of the Chicago School, they think of Milton Friedman. And of course, his famous work on the positivist approach to economics really took hold. And I think the rest of the Chicago School folks really, exemplified that and carried that approach forward. So for the listeners, the positivist approach is really this approach of gathering data and putting that data into models to kind of discover economic law. And this is a process that we as Austrians, we take a little different approach. We want to take a logical, deductive approach to derive economic law rather than this inductive approach. And so that's Becker's approach. Now, there are some interesting things that come out of his book. So his famous book here, I like to have visual aids with me. So his book, A Treatise on the Family, really pulled together. It was a treatise that pulled together some of his early research from the 1950s and 60s with other economists like Barrow, and he consolidates it here in this book. Now, there's some interesting things that come out of his approach. One of the things that you have to do in positivism in order to make your models work in a sort of elegant mathematic fashion is that you've got to make some assumptions about the way the world works. And one of the most startling examples of this was when Becker's describing parental choices around inheritance. He makes the assumption that over the lifespan of a family that parental preferences do not change. You read that and say, this is not a real world assumption. We know that some kids behave badly. Certain things happen in family life. Maybe your assets when you go to make the inheritance aren't quite what you thought they would be. This is really disconnected from real family life. And so that's one area where you take a look at the positivist approach and say, boy, these are really strong assumptions that don't really align with the real world. Now, that's a strike against Becker. Now, what was interesting, and I was kind of happy to see, especially as I was working through the dissertation and book writing process, is that Becker, at one point, when he's talking about fertility choice, another key area of family economics, he mentions the importance of interest rates and that there is a positive correlation between interest rates and total fertility. And so that's something that I did want to take a look at and explore a little more deeply and develop a theory in the Austrian tradition that looks at the impact of interest rates and how that would impact our behavior, or what we call our time preference rates. And so that was really a nice springboard for me to develop an Austrian theory around the relationship between interest rates and fertility. So that's an important section of my book, I think.
Out of curiosity, I mean, does it move that other things equal, the lower the interest rate, people have more kids?
Actually, the lower the interest rates, right? This is an indicator. If we've got a central bank that is suppressing interest rates, this is going to drive a higher time preference rate. So what do we get when we have that suppressed interest rate? Well, we tend to have overconsumption on the part of households. And this becomes a challenge if we're consuming all of our income. We don't have much savings for the future. And having children is really a future-oriented sort of activity, sort of thing you need to plan a little bit for what's coming next, not just 9 months down the road, but 5, 10, 20 years or more. And so what I've theorized here is that a suppression of interest rates is going to drive more of that overconsumption, which makes having additional children a little more difficult. You might say it fosters a climate or a culture of short-termism, and certainly children don't really fit that kind of category, that kind of plan, that kind of way of living.
Okay, yeah. So just to where my intuition misled me there is because I was thinking there's a sense in which children are in a long-term investment, right? Like it's the upfront costs, and if interest rates are lower, other things equal, you engage in longer-term projects, but it's not that you're not borrowing money from the bank in order to go have a kid. And so that's kind of the difference as opposed to like building an apartment complex or something.
Yeah. And of course this points to one of the things that monetary policy doesn't impact everyone in the same way. Right. And that's one of the points that Cantillon and all the Austrians have made, is that with that interest rate suppression through increased money supply, that there are some who benefit and then there are others who are harmed. And so this observation kind of matches up with some work by Charles Murray. So Charles Murray, I know he's a controversial author for a number of reasons, but setting that aside, his 2012 book entitled Coming Apart described how the upper echelons of society in the United States from the 1960s and forward have largely maintained traditional family life and traditional fertility patterns, where it's the old nursery rhyme, first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes the baby in the baby carriage, right? He's saying that people who have been on the winning side of the economy over the last 60 years, they follow that traditional pattern. Whereas much of the middle class and virtually all of the poor have set aside these traditional family patterns. And so he calls it a new form of segregation. But as I was reading Murray's work, it occurred to me, wait a minute. He is describing household realities for the beneficiaries of an inflationary economy, and then the downsides for households that are on the wrong end of it. Now, Murray was not attempting to give a full explanation as to why this has happened, but he did point to things like education and how there's been a new approach to that since the 1960s. And he says that it's the return on brains that makes some households wealthier, and those who don't get the same amounts of education, they wind up worse off. Now, as I read that, I thought, well, wait a minute. It might not be so much the return on brains as it is the returns in a financialized economy. In other words, the industries that have benefited from financialization, the individuals who are in those industries, their households are better off. And wouldn't you know it, it's the households largely in and around the Washington, D.C. area, areas where you have massive government expenditures, whether it's through military industrial complex, maybe the green industrial complex in some cases. You'll see those individuals and their households doing better and having a better shot, if you will, at sustainable household life, taking care of their kids, having the desired number of kids, investing in your children for education, and so on and so forth. But those who have not benefited from that process have been left behind. And if you're a young man who's, maybe got an unstable work situation, you're in an industry that doesn't have much potential income growth, that frankly does not make you a great candidate for marriage. That's just the facts of it. And that's what Murray was observing. But I think we just have what I wanted to provide here was an Austrian explanation that's related to monetary policy and how it's made its way through culture and family life.
Okay, thank you for that. And maybe just as an, I don't know if aside is the right word, but just to elaborate a bit more for people who aren't familiar, like in the economics literature and just generally, like the Becker approach to social issues, it's very, rationalistic, let's say. And so he might have something on the economics of crime. And so there, the issue is not just moralistically like, oh, stealing is bad and let's punish it, but also, well, hey, if you're a criminal and you're rational, let's at least model it as if you're just rational and looking at costs and benefits. And if the punishment, and so that's like leads to things like maybe it's better to spend more money on catching criminals and giving them a light sentence versus, grabbing one guy and giving him throwing the book at him. Anyway, just that sort of approach, which to some people strikes them as like, oh, I don't want to even think about these issues. But anyway, it's a nice lens. If you want to go ahead and look at it like that, to say, yeah, it's not that the axe murderer is sitting around, engaging in Socratic introspection, but on the other hand, it's also not correct just to say, oh, these people are, just all unhinged lunatics and criminals don't respond to incentives whatsoever. Like that would be incorrect too.
Right. That's a great point. And I want to hook on to that word rational a little bit, because one of the other thinkers who preceded Becker was Joseph Schumpeter. And he had a passage in his famous book on, really the process of capitalism, democracy, and socialism. So this book, 1942, it was written, and he has a passage in there about the loss of what he calls the family motive. There's a really interesting passage there. And in it, he says that due to the successes of capitalism, the wealth that it produces, that eventually over time, people will develop sort of a hyper-rational outlook on life. And this is kind of Schumpeter talking in predictive terms, but he says that people will develop this hypersensitivity to cost-benefit analysis, and everything will be sort of a coldly calculated decision. And because capitalism brings such prosperity and enjoyable experiences, that people will begin to diminish the value of family life, and especially the value of children relative to the benefits that they experience due to the wealth that comes through the capitalist system. Now, what's interesting there is that Schumpeter is really describing a capitalist system under conditions of intervention. He is describing, I think, a world where it's not far off from the world that we sort of have, where you have values being sort of inverted, where careerism is more important than, say, raising a family, materialism more important than maybe leisure activities, the arts, or just enjoying a barbecue with your friends, right? And so he's describing that world, but what he doesn't do is describe the real mechanics of how we might get there as a society. How might we arrive at that more materialistic, rationalistic, or you might say hyper-rational way of thinking? And it's my viewpoint that this is one of the outcomes or consequences of living in an inflationary world, where we do indeed need to think more about stock portfolios than we otherwise would have. We need to think more and more about returns to our time at work so we can service our debts and rising cost of living than we otherwise would. And so I think that Schumpeter was around the target, but he missed identifying what might drive people to that kind of rationalistic mindset, and then the devaluing of family life, but especially devaluing of children.
Well, let me give you a chance here, because you kind of just walked into the next point I wanted to make. That I wanted to ask you like these more esoteric, deep thought questions, but why don't we do the meat and potatoes that I'm sure some of the listeners are dying to know? That like things like, oh, gee, what's going on with the divorce rate and fertility in general? And I gather that at least part of your story is that you're saying this isn't just looking at what's happening on TV or something, that inflation has something to do with a lot of these broader trends that a lot of people are worried about.
Yeah, and so these are some broad trends that have different outcomes. So I'll kind of work backwards. Really, when we think about family economics, there's three categories. The three are family formation or marriage, and then fertility choices. The third then is divorce, as you mentioned. And divorce is the least studied and least understood phenomenon, because, look, we know there are many, many reasons why marriages break apart. But when you look at survey data and when people talk about the causes of divorce, money or finances is one of the leading reasons. Now, here's a terrible economist joke, but when I raise this question to new audiences, I say, "What's the leading cause of divorce?" And they start chit-chatting. It's this and it's that. I said, well, marriage is, right? You can't. All right. So yeah, dad jokes, but there you go. Well, anyhow, finances.
I thought you were going to say half the crowd would say men and the other half would say women.
Yeah, there you go. But this is the case, right? Financial tension, questions around money, deceit around money. These are some major categories. Now, the question I want to address here, though, is what has happened to divorce rates over time? Really interesting kind of phenomenon has happened. And again, I use Charles Murray's work as kind of a springboard for this. He was examining family life since the 1960s up to 2010. But what's happened in that period is that from the 1960s and 70s, we do see that inflationary period that really gets a kickstart with the funding of the Vietnam War and the welfare state. Then move forward to the 1970s. We come off the gold standard under Nixon's temporary suspension of convertibility.
Well, he had to
gold.
protect us from those speculators.
Those darn speculators, man.
Hacking the poor dollars, minding his own business.
Yeah. And so this is a period where most people know, right? This is the 60s and 70s. This is a real spike in the divorce rate. And indeed, that was the case. And then you look at the 1980s, and that divorce rate kind of levels off. Now, an overly simplistic approach, if somebody were to say inflation in the family and, divorce, you're just saying that when prices go up, divorce happens. Well, no, not exactly. What has happened over time is that indeed there was a leveling off of divorces in the 1980s. And then about late 80s up until today, divorce rates have continued to decline. Well, what I'm making the argument for is that what has happened is that there has been a liquidation of marriage among the middle and lower classes. And so the marriages that are forming in the 1980s and later tend to be amongst two college graduates who have very similar values, very similar earning potential, and so on and so forth. And they are tend to be among the winners in an inflationary world. They work in industries that are largely stable. They're not riddled with job loss and uncertainty, and their family lives remain relatively stable. And so that, I think, is a better explanation for the pattern that we've seen in divorce rates over time. So it is not as simple as, inflation up, divorces up. That's not exactly what's happening, because we have to factor in what has been happening to divorce rates over time. So I hope that makes sense. But that's just one category that's really important in family economics that I think has been understudied. We don't totally understand the causes for the rise and then fall, but I think that what I've described here is hopefully somewhat accurate. There's been this liquidation of marriage among the middle and lower classes, and that's why they don't have as many divorces. So
and that actually ties into your joke, right? Let me say this to you and make sure. Are you saying something like, when it was unexpected, and yet, like, you had a bunch of families that were formed under like the old rules of the game, as it were, the 50s and 60s, and then the inflation of the 70s going in the early 80s hit, that was just kind of out of the blue for a lot of people, and it really strained traditional marriages.
Yeah.
But then once you're through that shock, and now we're in the new normal, and inflation, came down from what it was like in 79 or whatever, that you're saying going forward, people are more robust to that, and it's just they're not getting married in the first place.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
And so
they're not getting married in the first place.
Right.
So, cohabitation, much more common. And look, I'm not saying that this is one of the challenges of writing a book like this. When you introduce a new variable that hasn't really been discussed, that variable being that inflation matters to family life, folks will think, well, you're saying that culture doesn't matter, feminism doesn't matter, education. No. All of these things matter. It's just that inflation hasn't been really given its due to this point. And so it is the case that if you look at divorce rates, say in the 1970s and then later to the 80s, that no-fault divorce law became really the standard approach throughout the states. And there is a bit that I talk about on that. And actually, there's an economist, I believe he's at the University of Michigan, Stephen Wolfers, if I remember his first name. But he did a study taking a close look at this using some econometrics and so forth, and said that no-fault divorce did have sort of an immediate and positive impact. In other words, new no-fault divorce law, divorces go up. But then it stabilized. There was sort of a short-lived increase in divorce rates. And his explanation, and I think it's a reasonable one, was that those people who took advantage of the no-fault divorce laws, those marriages were already on the rocks to begin with. So they were already teetering on the edge of coming apart anyways. And so that's how he explains that short-term bump in inflation rates that are derived from no-fault divorce law. So not saying that divorce law doesn't matter. Custody law, that has been shown to matter in divorce decisions. It's just, again, the point of bringing this book forward is that inflation and the cultural consequences of inflation, they also matter.
Yeah, and I guess it sounds like you're trying to, as Austrians typically do, that they're aware of, some of the more hyper rationalistic models and like those tendencies, but they also just don't say, let's assume for modeling purposes that people really are like that, and kind of, try to be realistic. That, for example, another one where I've seen the reaction you're talking about is if somebody says, hey, if the government starts paying unwed mothers to have more babies, don't be surprised when they have more babies. And people will say, oh, so you're saying, some particular, 18-year-old just sitting at home and like runs a spreadsheet and then decides to go have a baby with, her boyfriend and then break up. And it's like, no, that's not what they're saying.
Yeah.
But with tens of millions of people in the relevant demographic, and you all of a sudden introduce this new incentive that, yes, statistically in the aggregate over decades, you're going to see an effect of that. Like that's
and that's a cultural effect, right? It's one of the categories of the inflation culture that I talk about in the book is the enhancement or the growth of moral hazard. It's the idea that you're going to take some risks or take on some challenges or risky behaviors that you wouldn't otherwise, because there's this idea that there's some kind of backstop. I should be able to fall back on really society kind of bailing me out, if you will. We've talked a lot in Austrian circles about the impact of, say, corporate bailouts. That's one type of manifestation of moral hazard in the banking industry or the auto industry. But there's also this mentality that among the poor, if you look around and say, well, there are some fallback mechanisms. I mean, I can pretty easily go and get income supplements or housing subsidies. This is available to me. And that becomes especially true in a second generation of people who have grown up under the welfare state and the fallback mechanisms that it does provide. And so, again, as you said, Bob, it's not that, some young woman is doing what you said. She's, looking at, okay, I'm 18, now I'm eligible for benefits. All right, where am I going to find myself impregnated? That's not that sort of process, but a general sense that there is that sort of fallback mechanism. It's modeled for us. And it, unfortunately, is one of the impacts of the welfare state, of course. Now, I think I should probably comment on this just a little bit. There's been a lot of discussion, as you said, about the impact of welfare state incentives that it creates. And it does, again, have some impact on family life, family formation. But I was really drilled on this in my dissertation. And the question was about, well, what about the welfare state? What about the ideology of interventionism? That's important. But if we look at the U.S. data, I'll just ask the question, which came first, the mechanisms of inflation through our central bank or the welfare state, the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson? Well, we were on a slow but steady, and certainly I think in some of your recent podcasts, you've walked through that the Fed has not always behaved in the same way, right? There have been different eras in which there have been accelerations of money printing, other times where it hasn't been as extreme. So it's not as though the Fed has had a single monolithic, on ramp to the same inflation rate. We know that that's not the case, but you think of the lifestyles that emerged in the 1920s. I mean, we call it the Roaring '20s for a reason. It's not just the stock market, but you look internationally at the inflationism that was happening in the 20s, and you see some cultural effects in Hungary, in Germany, of more extreme forms of inflation. But those are just some historic episodes running up to the creation of the American welfare state that were inflationary periods. And so what is really the cry of the origins of the welfare state? It's that, well, the poor can't make ends meet, so we've got to subsidize their lifestyle. Well, why were they unable to make ends meet? It's because they were already living in an inflationary world where the necessities of life were becoming increasingly difficult to afford. And so I make the argument that, look, inflationism, even though it's not as bad as it could have been all the time, that preceded the welfare state and is often the reason that people ask for welfare solutions. And that leads to what I and others have described as an intervention spiral, right? Instead of undoing the root cause or repealing the root cause of the problems that we see today, we slap on legislative or regulatory band-aids that lead to other unintended consequences.
And also, Jeff, if you could maybe elaborate a bit, because I think like let's say a standard conservative, for example, hearing this and like seeing the title of your book and everything, might just say, oh yeah, like it's hard to buy a house now because of inflation and, you know, you're a young man, and of course that's going to delay the formation of a family, you know, that's which is all true. But in the Austrian tradition specifically, it's not just that, oh, inflation's bad because it makes things expensive. It's that it causes the boom bust cycle, at least, you know, the way that, and that, so again, it's not simply that, oh, wow, stuff gets more expensive over time. It's that these wild swings in the business cycle with unemployment and people getting thrown out of work,
right?
That also in the Austrian view is ultimately one of the offshoots of inflationism.
Yeah, that's right. So some of the conservative talking points have been, and I saw, I think, a clip from Tucker Carlson a while back, and it might have been at a CPAC event or something like that. And he was railing against credit card issuance to young people, 25, 30%, these, they're gouging you, they're making life harder. And as an Austrian, I said, well, yeah, high interest rates, that's not real great to deal with it. But what's the root cause? The root cause of this cycle is the suppression of interest rates, right? And this is something that we need to be concerned about. And I think is unique to the Austrian school, that we sound the alarm when interest rates are driven below what the market would produce. And so, yeah, that suppression is really the key that we want to look at. So, yeah, you're right. That is definitely a conservative talking point. And so we've got an opportunity, I think, to speak to our conservative friends and really do a good job, hopefully, of informing them of the harmful effects of the Federal Reserve's interest rate suppression.
Well, and that, I mean, just to expand on that, it seems to me, and tell me if I'm overstepping here, that part of the contribution you're making here with your book is to say to like the average, let's say MAGA person, or I don't know what label you want to put on, but who are in some kind of, particularly with the tariff issue, saying all you, libertarian economists and even you Austrian types specifically, yeah, we get where you're coming from. Economic liberty is great. But, there's bigger things. There's more important stuff going on, like cultural issues and kids, look at all these. And it seems like you're kind of showing these aren't just completely divorced, no pun intended, divorced concepts that actually you should care about the central bank, even if you don't care just about real GDP growth, that actually this affects a lot of those other cultural, social issues that conservatives care about.
Yeah, Bob, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. I share those concerns.
Right.
As a Christian, as a person who appreciates traditional values and so on, I see that there is a problem here. Short-termism, materialism, rampant indebtedness for, I work at Cornerstone University, and we have students at every university throughout the country going into debt, and this is causing or is contributing to some significant adulthood milestones. Yeah, I see the problems, but their solution is to add additional interventions. But ours is to say, time out, let's look at what's gotten us here. And inflation is a major part of that picture of our cultural decay. And that's why it is an interesting shift for me, because my dissertation was entitled "The Family in the Inflation Culture." But for most publishers, that's not a very appealing title. So a more snappy title, if you will, was "Inflation in the Family." But I think that the dissertation really, that title really gets at it, is that there are these cultural effects that come about. So that come about from an inflationary monetary policy. So those three, there are actually three categories of cultural effect. I mentioned moral hazard, but also there's two other key ones. One is the enhancement or the acceleration, if you will, of income inequality. So this is something that, again, harkens back to the Cantillon effect, a rising wealth inequality that comes about under an inflationary regime. And then The third one is a culture of indebtedness, because Guido's Ethics of Money Production has a nice chapter on how to be frugal in the traditional sense in an inflationary environment is financial suicide. But what is going to make you succeed? Well, this comes back to houses, right? Well, it's to get into the housing market and to leverage as much as you possibly can as early as you can. So the old advice about when should I buy a house is, well, yesterday, right?
Right.
It's to get in early and with as much credit leverage as you can. And that is what we call the debt culture in the book. But
just on that point, Jeff, if you don't, I've been at seminars, for my consulting work with various groups that it just, my travels took me to places where I'd be sitting in seminars of people like teaching the audience, like having workshops on here's how you become like a house flipper on the weekends, that, that kind of thing. Yeah. And in there, like I've heard people from the state, and what's funny is they're not wrong in terms of the narrow thing, what they're saying like, oh, don't ever pay down. Why would I ever want to pay down my mortgage debt? 30-year fix when I don't care what the house is like. All I know is I got to wait just 5 years and inflation's going to mean I can rent that place out for more than the mortgage payment. Like, I don't care what the place is like, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thinking and in its own terms, especially back like when there was the deduction on the interest. So anyway, it was amazing that, certainly you make like a Dave Ramsey fall out of his chair or something, but in terms of the advice that, if you're in this environment right now and banks are willing to give you 30-year loans at a fixed interest rate, on real estate, like worse that, you could just bulldoze the place in 10 years and start from scratch and you're probably still going to do okay. So anyway, I'm just saying that's all driven because of this inflationary environment.
And that is sort of a subcategory, or maybe you might call a consequence of that debt culture, that rush into debt. It breeds financial fragility at the household level. And so, and it's not just houses. I mean, you spend a little time, scrolling YouTube shorts or TikTok, you'll have folks out there saying, oh, here's a great scheme to leverage your credit card and go ahead and buy luxury watches and then flip them. Everybody's, it's arbitrage, man. This is a practice that, goodness sakes, I mean, that just is so far removed from sort of the conventional, traditional approach to household or individual finance. And we can look at that and say, my gosh, you're setting yourself up for financial ruin. And that could be true, but what about your family, right? If you're a person who's maybe, on the side, not telling your spouse you're opening up extra credit cards to go do this or that, to leverage your way and take advantage of the arbitrage, like, you're real swift there, fella. You are setting yourself up for a very bad financial outcome, and then there's impact on your family life. I mean, there's no way around this, and other forms of sort of this financial fragility that I get really concerned about, because as I work with young people, especially young men who are really into their sports, if you're on sort of the middle class to lower end of things, you might not be taking financial risks by leveraging into houses and flipping them and doing credit cards to flip luxury goods. But you might be sport gambling in order to hit it big. And that's another form of, that's probably moral hazard as well, just increased risk taking. That's a major concern. Again, if you're that sort of young man and you're trying to, court a young lady and she realizes that these are your financial habits, good luck. That does not bode well for family formation. Let alone your own personal financial situation. And so it just kind of puzzled me as I was doing the literature review for the dissertation in this book, that many economists of different stripes, mainstream, Chicago, Keynesians, were making some connections between, say, rising house prices and delays in marriage. But nobody was taking just the one additional step to say that, gee, monetary policy might have something to do with rising home prices. And so in a sense, I feel like this was a very sort of elementary exercise on my part, but I was really set back when I realized nobody took that extra step. And I think that's one of the benefits of studying Austrian economics, is we do get trained in a little bit longer causal chains and explanations for what's happening in the real world. Whereas the positivist approach is to say, plug X variable, you're going to get Y variable. How long does it take? And not go much farther beyond that. And so, and for me, this approach has been very rewarding on a lot of fronts. As an undergrad, I studied history as well as economics. Also have some theological training, so I have a little bit of, well, not a little bit. I have a lot of interest in cultural, social, and even moral, moral attitudes that prevail in society. And so this project allowed me to take kind of an integrated approach to what's happening in family life. And so, so that's kind of where this all came from.
Okay, well, great. Yeah, just the joke when I was in academia and go to like these lunch brown bag seminars, and people would come and present their papers with the econometric, and I would just always say to the grad students, like, you got to get 2 stars in the results, otherwise it's not important. In terms of like, they would do the regression analysis, which so
and that was something I acknowledged right away. We are looking at a data set about family formation, fertility, divorce over 60 plus years. So to find statistical significance, because there are so many things that matter in family formation, fertility, and so on, that we're probably not going to get these knock 'em dead econometric results and wow, the mainstream folks. That's not really what I'm trying to accomplish here. We're trying to say that monetary policy, inflationism has an impact on culture and the way we live our lives. And that manifests in what we've seen in family over the past 60 years or plus, 60 years or more.
Well, that's a great place to wrap up, folks. My guest has been Jeff Degner. The book is Inflation and the Family. Jeff, thanks for your time here today and for writing the book.
Oh, thank you, Bob. I appreciate the invitation.
Sure thing. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.